Amen. Good to see you all. I think you can hear me out there. I like using this not because I feel like I need it, but it just looks cool. So I feel like I got the mic so I can walk around. But so great to be here with you all. Appreciate Mike's intro and just appreciate the Lambs so much. As Mike mentioned, we go back to teen ministry days, and that really bonds people because of the heart that we have for people, but also kind of the stuff that we go through together working with the teens. All positive things. The good, the bad, and everything in between. But yeah, I just love them so much, and I hope that you feel this, but very fortunate to have Mike and Kristen here in the ministry in Boston. So, and just, yeah, great to meet many of you. Great to have the indie throwback, and so my indie crew over here, I did, as was mentioned, my PhD was from Indiana University, and I have some of my indie friends from back in the day who I didn't expect to be here. So just so great to connect with you all and have this opportunity to talk about parenting. And so the title of the class, so Biblical Foundations of Parenting. So we'll talk about what I call Ephesians 6:4 parenting, so parenting styles. And then we'll connect that to brain development. I'll talk a lot about brain development during the adolescent time period, and I'll talk about why this is the demarcation, or why I think about the demarcation of adolescence being between the ages of 10 to 25. So you might not be there yet with your children, but I think good to anticipate some of these things and take some of those practices and start instilling those within your children now. But before we get into all that, I did want to give you a shot of the family up here. So this is my crew, and this is just how we look all the time, well-dressed, and just kidding. This was the half a second where we were all in the right spot, didn't fall off the wall there. But this is a shot from West Point. It's called Trophy Point, just overlooking the Hudson River. You have Storm King Mountain on the left, Breakneck Ridge on the right. Just a beautiful place to take a picture. And again, by the grace of God, we were all in the right spot looking at the camera for 0.5 seconds. So that worked out great. But my beautiful wife over here, inside and out, Katie, I'll talk about her in just a minute. So we've been married for coming up on 12 years, which has just been such a great journey with her. My daughter Evelyn here is 9. Vivian, 7, Lillian is 5, she'll be 6 next month, and then William, 2.5, going on 10. So just a great experience being able to parent them, and I love doing it alongside my wife, who I have to say quite a bit about her as I begin. So Katie has a very strong, impressive background in lacrosse, and so she went to Duke University on a full-ride scholarship to play lacrosse. Her junior year, she won the Tewaaraton Trophy, which nobody knows what that is, but it's the Heisman equivalent for women's lacrosse. So she was the top player in the nation her junior year. So, you can only go up from there. But so that was her junior year. She went on to play on the the World Cup team in 2009. They won a world championship in Prague, so she's a world champion as well, and is now in, I think I said 4 last night, but it'll be 5 Hall of Fames: Baltimore local Hall of Fame, Duke Athletics Hall of Fame, and then in January she was inducted into the U.S. Lacrosse Hall of Fame. So, yeah, which is like so cool and so impressive, but I hesitate to bring that up because I think oftentimes when I bring that up as a speaker, people are like, well, where's she? Like, we want to hear from her. You're in 0 Hall of Fames, and so we want to talk to her. Yeah, she's just such an impressive person. I mean, even, that's impressive, but even more so as a spiritual woman. So grateful to do this parenting thing with her. And I just want to begin with, similar to what Mike was praying about, I mean, it's easy to get caught up in the parenting aspect of the grind and the rut and the challenge and the difficulty and the stress, and I'll share a lot about that we forget the incredible opportunity that God has bestowed upon you to take his creation and mold it and shape it into what God has designed for all of us, but for them in particular. And, we get some shaping in our own lives along that journey as well. So I think important to set the stage with what an opportunity God has given us to be great parents. And, I'm speaking as someone who doesn't always recognize that opportunity. I try to see it, and certainly not a perfect parent. I hope you're not disappointed, but I don't have all the answers. But I do have, I think, some useful suggestions from both, or I should say three things. One, the scriptures, which we'll dive into in just a minute, experience, but then also what I've learned academically. And all the answers aren't there. I think there's some good answers there, but to the extent that they do point us back to scriptures and illuminate those things, I think can be helpful. So I want to present some of those things to you today. So that's where we're headed. So hopefully everybody's good, and that's what the description was for the class, because that's what we're doing. So here's some objectives for you with this first class. So we'll get into parenting styles, but the idea here is that we're going to describe the two dimensions of Ephesians 6:4 parenting. So we'll take a deeper dive into Ephesians 6:4. I call this a parenting style, which I'll get into more in a minute, and we'll look at some other scriptures related to that. But I think God really sets out for us in Ephesians 6:4, and again, other passages, this style of parenting that he uses himself and that Jesus uses himself, but also that he desires for us to use in our parenting of his creation. Identify the 4 parenting styles and their outcomes. So 4 parenting styles that come from research. Talk about how that connects to Ephesians 6:4 parenting and the outcomes associated with those. We'll examine our personal parenting styles. I think it's good to take stock of where we are, where God wants us to go, and then how we can get there. And I do want to say up front, this happens quite a bit, sometimes for myself, but when I teach the course at the Rocky Mountain School and when I do parenting classes like this, it's really easy to lay out for me to lay out things as far as, I think this is what God's expectations are, here are some ideas about how to get there, and for us to get into guilt right away. Like, oh my gosh, look at all the stuff that I'm not doing. That's not the idea, okay? I'll present some ideas and some directions for you, some helpful strategies, but the goal is to not get you into guilt. Okay, so just let's be positive. Let's take away what we can, but also remember that guilt is an emotion that God has designed for us that can be useful, and so in some instances it can point us to, okay, well, yeah, here's a way that I need to grow, and so even just taking a positive view of that emotional response, I think, can be helpful. So I want to say that up front, and then we'll set some intentions around becoming what I call an Ephesians 6:4 parent. And then we'll take a brief pause, and then we'll get into the second class, which is more on brain development. So let's dig into the scriptures, I think an important starting place. So Ephesians 6:4 parenting. When we look at the New Testament, we see 2 important scriptures that speak specifically to parents. Fathers in particular are named in both. What we'll look at in Ephesians, then related verse in Colossians. But there are certainly other places where parenting comes up, but I think Ephesians 6:4 in the New Testament directly addresses parents. And I think there's a lot we can unpack here. Easy to just look over it really quickly and say, okay, I think this is what this is suggesting, but I want to take a deeper dive into that. So Ephesians 6:4. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. Other translations say, do not exasperate your children, do not stir them up to anger, but bring them up. Another way to say that is to nurture them in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And other ways to translate discipline could also be translated as training, and then instruction typically translated as instruction. So important passage there, and I'll dive into that in just a moment, but I wanted to pull up a related passage. So Colossians 3:21, fathers, again, fathers addressed specifically here, do not provoke your children. So similar to Ephesians 6:4, and then gives an outcome associated with that way of being or that style of parenting as far as exasperating your children, lest they become discouraged, or so that they do not become discouraged. And when we break down these passages and take a closer look at these, I think we get a good idea of what God is after here. And I really see two dimensions. This first dimension here of do not provoke, again, repeated in Colossians 3. So, lots of different ways to provoke people or to stir them up to anger, especially as it relates to children. Could be on the side of being cold and indifferent, or it could be on the side of overbearing, aggressive, abrasive, and other related ways of being. And those ways of parenting can stir our children up to anger. And so Paul, as he's addressing the church in Ephesus, and then later in Colossae, says we need to avoid that way of being. But then he says to bring them up, to nurture them, to raise them in a particular way. And he goes on to say, in the discipline, and we'll break that down a little bit more so in just a moment, but discipline can also be thought of as training, a consistent way of bringing them up in the instruction of the Lord. So that training, that discipline, implies this idea of consistency, but also can mean corrective action. So it can be, there's positive aspects of discipline and training, but there can be the more difficult or challenging, perhaps negative side of correction and instruction. So inputting new knowledge or new ideas into our children. So I'll give a little commentary on this in just a moment, but I do want to mention up front that when we think about how God, via Paul, is addressing us, he's laying out this style of parenting that God demonstrates in his way of parenting us, and that Jesus demonstrates in his, and again, I think we recognize that Jesus wasn't a biological father, but is the father to us all. And when you see the way that Jesus interacts with people, the way that he parents, the way that he guides and leads, we see this same style. And I did want to highlight two passages from the Old Testament that I think speak to this. So Ephesians 34, 6 and 7. So again, Ephesians 34, 6 and 7. As I read this, think about how this relates to, especially what's talked about in Ephesians 6, 4. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. Related passage, Numbers 14, verse 18. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love and forgiving sin and rebellion. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. So we see two dimensions of God's parenting style there. Abounding in steadfast love, forgiving, gracious, merciful, all these what we would typically identify as positive ways of being as a father, parent. And then we read the second, but we're good with that. I mean, that's awesome. And then we read the second part, and we're like, whew, that seems a little harsh, a little tough there. And it's not so much, I believe anyway, that we're to take this so literally. But I think what's being conveyed here is that, yes, God is loving, he's warm, he's nurturing, he's all those things that we need. But the other dimension of what we need is correction. When sin comes up, when we are off track as his children, corrective action is necessary, especially as it relates to sin. And thank God for being that kind of father. Sin is destructive. And, it's something that all of us have the potential for and can get into on a regular basis. And, man, to get that out of us, sometimes we need that tougher discipline, that corrective action. And so we see those two dimensions in God and his parenting style, and we see that same way of being conveyed in these passages here and throughout other passages within the Bible. Some commentary on this passage. So a great book, more of an academic book, but Kostenberger, God, Marriage, and Family, Rebuilding the Biblical Foundation, speaks to this two dimensions. By way of implications, fathers and mothers, so again, fathers addressed specifically, but just great principles for parenting, must strike a balance between proper discipline and loving nurture and support, but neither the encouraging parent who is all support and no discipline, who neglects to discipline his child, nor the strict disciplinarian who's all discipline and all corrective action, but no warmth and support, fulfills the biblical ideal of parenting. And, I think sometimes we can think of these things as opposed to one another. It's either, on one end, I'm a disciplinarian. On the one end, I'm warm and nurturing, but we need both of those things. And I wouldn't even say maybe that it's necessarily a balance, but we have to make sure that we have both of those things in our parenting, in our way of being. And so I see this as two-dimensional. Ephesians 6:4 parenting as a two-dimensional style of parenting. So dimension one, this idea of being warm, supportive, responsive. The passage that I'll mention that I think highlights this, so Ephesians 4, verse 2, Paul's addressing the whole church here. He's not directly talking to parents, but I think this is just a good takeaway for us in terms of parenting, but more broadly, how we are with one another. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Think about that way of being and what that looks like and how warm and supportive and responsive that is. Again, with one another, but in our parenting, humble. Come down to be where our children are. Gentle, not abrasive and abrupt and aggressive, but gentle. Patient. Whew! I could use some more patience on a regular basis. And I'll share some stories, one in particular from a couple of days ago where I was stressed and I was not feeling very patient. But it's just something that can come up that I need to work on. But being patient, bearing with one another in love. And we can think of love as willing the good in the life of someone else. And so this idea of bearing with one another in love, so being patient with them, and no matter who it is, no matter what the situation is, willing the good in the life of another for the sake of the other. That's that first dimension. When Paul is saying, do not exasperate, this is non-exasperation right here. Warm, responsive, supportive. And so Kostenberger has some things to say about that. Fathers are to avoid any attitudes, words, or actions that have the effect of provoking anger in their children, including excessively severe discipline, unreasonably harsh demands, abuse of authority, arbitrariness, unfairness, constant nagging and condemnation, subjecting a child to humiliation, and all forms of gross insensitivity to a child's needs and sensibilities. That's a lot of stuff, but it's helpful for us to see that that's all part of this. Do not provoke, do not stir up anger, do not exasperate our children. And I think one of the key things that I take away from this is that exasperation can look like both ends of this spectrum. Too overbearing, too tough, too aggressive. But the other side of that is true, which is distant, cold, and insensitive. Both of those ways of being are not part of God's plan, which is responsive, warm, loving, supportive. So that's the target, and when we do that, we avoid the provoking to anger and the exasperation. So that's the first dimension of Ephesians 6:4 parenting. The second dimension has to do with training, being firm, and discipline. And a familiar passage probably to many of you, Proverbs 22, verse 6, train up a child in the way he should go, or she, and when he or she is old, they will not turn from it. One thing I want to convey with this is that, and I think this is important up front before we dig into what this means, I think what it doesn't mean is if I do X, Y, and Z, I will get this output. Right? Parenting is not a science, even though I'll give you a formula to think about, but it is not a science. It is an art. And I think where we get into trouble sometimes is thinking about passages, learning things in a parenting class, reading things in a book, and thinking, man, God, yeah, if I just do X, Y, and Z, my kid will become a Christian. And that's just the way it works. And then we get disappointed when that doesn't happen that way. And it doesn't mean that you necessarily did anything wrong. Your spiritual standing before God is not dependent on whether or not your kid becomes a Christian. And I think we get into trouble when we have that kind of thinking. Now, that said, there are things that we do need to strive for and ways of being that God calls us to be with our children, just like him, just like Jesus, and we do that in faith, in confidence, in love, and with a lot of grace, and then we give the rest to him. That is God's business, what he does with people, including our children. But we have an important role to play in that, and training is absolutely an important aspect of that. And we see that in Ephesians 6:4. We see that in other passages throughout Proverbs, including this. Kids need training. I mean, we all need training, but kids need training. They need guidance. They need discipline. They need instruction. They need direction. They need guidelines from us as their parents. God has entrusted you with these children, aspects or elements of his creation, to train them in his ways. And Deuteronomy 6:6-7 talks about this and gives some more practical examples about how to do that. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Get them into your children and into their hearts. But look what it starts with, though. Make sure it's on your heart first. For out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Oftentimes we think about that in negative terms, which that's part of it. I mean, that's what Jesus was referring to there. But the positive side of that is true. If it's in you, it will come out of you. And that's an important starting place for impressing these things on our children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. And you can do those things specifically, and that's great. But the idea here is that no matter what you do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Colossians 3:17. Everything we do needs to be in the Lord, about the Lord, and for the Lord, including what we do with our children. And Kostenberger has, I think, some good commentary on this as well. So he's talking about the Greek here, going back to Ephesians 6:4, discipline, so paideia, and instruction, nouthesia, are closely related but probably not synonymous. In its New Testament usage, the term translated discipline may refer to education or training in general, or specifically to chastisement for wrongdoing. In Ephesians 6:4, the reference is in all likelihood to training in general, while encompassing discipline for wrongdoing as well. So the big idea here, the takeaway is that training is kind of the overarching idea, and training is any course of action that is meant to build someone in a direction but is consistent and intentional. And relatedly, discipline is along those lines as well, but this idea of paideia or discipline is both, yes, the training aspect, but relatedly, correction or chastisement for wrongdoing. And that is the reality. All of us, including our children, need correction. They need firmness in their lives. And God calls us to do those things and to be that way with our children. And then connected to that, they need the instruction. They need the teaching, in many ways the example that we set, but then also teaching them, saying things to them that are along the lines of education in our Lord. So I want to bring up an image that I think brings it all together and that's hopefully helpful to think about these things in a more of a systematic way. So the first dimension of Ephesians 6:4 parenting is this warmth, supportive, responsiveness, humble, gentle, patient, all these things. That helps us to not exasperate our children. That's the context for our parenting, this warm, supportive relationship that we have with our children. I think that's primary. I think that helps the other stuff to work and to go well. So within that context, within that warm context, that first dimension of Ephesians 6:4 parenting, you have these other elements. So training, again, a consistent, intentional way of being with our children, bringing them up in the training of the Lord. That involves instruction, inputting new knowledge to our children. Who is God? How is God with us? Who is the Spirit? Who is Jesus? What were his teachings about X, Y, and Z? Those are aspects of instruction. And then relatedly, discipline, which involves all those things. These are mutually reinforcing ideas or ways of being. But again, that discipline piece involves that corrective action. And I think sometimes we stray away from that last element because we're afraid that we're going to corrupt our children in some way, shape, or form if we upset them, or if we correct them, or if we show them that they're doing something wrong. But that's not the biblical, that's not the way that God is with us, and that's not the call. That is a big part of what we do as parents, but it's also not all discipline, right? So you need all of this, but I think the idea here is putting that into the context of a warm, loving relationship. So here's a formula that, again, it's not a science, but the idea here is that maybe this is a helpful way to think about it. When you take Ephesians 6:4 and you think about those two dimensions as 6 and 4, so 6 is that first dimension of warm, responsive, loving, patient, humble, gentle, and so forth. And you combine that with firm, biblical discipline and teaching, you get perfect 10 parenting. Money back guaranteed. No, I'm kidding. And again, the idea is not to give you this formula that if I just do this and this is what I get, or that there is perfect parenting. But what I'm conveying here is hopefully a way to remember this and put this together, that you need both of those dimensions. The warmth is the context. Firm, discipline, instruction is also important within that context. And that's the goal. That's the idea. That's what God is conveying. That's the way Jesus is. That's the way God parents us, I believe. What I would overlay on this would be some big words as well. First would be the Spirit. Hey, you all have the Spirit in you that helps you be this way, do these things, get back on track. Jesus talks about the Spirit reminding us of all the things that he's taught us. So that should hopefully bring confidence in what you're doing. That Spirit of Jesus exists within you to help you be who you need to be, would help you to be the parent that you need to be as well. You have the Spirit in you. The other thing that I would overlay over this is grace. I can't say that word enough in a parenting class. And last night, I was talking to one of the parents afterwards, and she was like, yeah, it was really helpful up front. And then later in the class, I just started feeling guilty about all the stuff that I'm not doing. And I was like, I'm with you. That's a good reminder for me to just keep saying the word grace throughout, because we need grace. Grace motivates us to keep going, to strive towards what God has in store for us, what God wants for us. But it helps us get back up when we make mistakes. 2 days ago, I had one of the worst parenting days that I had in a while. I needed some grace. It was a tough day at work. I had an interaction with a colleague that just did not sit with me well, and so I was thinking about it afterwards, and then my wife was coaching in a different place, so she was up in upstate New York at Colgate. They had an away game. So I get home, and I'm dealing with that, and then I'm on a work call, and then I get a message that my daughter wants to be part of the audition in school for the talent show, but she needs her white tights, and she needs her outfit, and I got to coordinate the music, and I'm trying to do, all these things at the same time, and I am stressed with a capital S and a capital trust, so the whole thing. And I so wanted her to be part of the audition and make it special for her, but yeah, it was just challenging with all these other things going on. And so, fortunately I was able to get through to Katie. She knew right where the white tights were, so we got that worked out. She goes over and does her audition, but in the meantime, I'm short with the kids, and I'm too rough on them, probably exasperating them. And by the end of the day, I'm like, man, that was not Ephesians 6:4 parenting. And I'm supposed to teach this class in a couple days on this stuff, but we're all in this together, right? Like we all have those times and those moments. But again, reminder is the Spirit is with you to help you, and there's grace. So much grace for us in these instances. God is a gracious God, abounding in steadfast love. So I went to bed and I texted my wife and I was like, yep, I need a reset. So, and that's the grace of God. So hopefully some helpful ideas in terms of how we can think about the scriptures, but Ephesians 6:4 parenting in particular. So what I would ask you to do at this point is to think about your own parenting style. So how would you evaluate your own parenting style? And so if you had these two dimensions in mind, that warm responsiveness, non-exasperation, on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you doing in that dimension? With the second dimension, you could break those down: instruction, training, discipline, put them all together. How would you rate yourself? If you are married, how would your spouse rate you on that? I think that can be helpful. And then, which this can be scary as well, but how would your kids rate you on those dimensions? Now, I'm not saying you need to necessarily check in with them every day, but that can be a helpful check-in. Sometimes I'll do that with my children. So, and I'll let them know sometimes, hey, I'm working on patience, and so I want you to know that. That's what I'm working on. God is working in me. I'm still flawed, and I have weaknesses, and there are things that I'm trying to improve in, and then I've checked in with them at different points. So, hey, Daddy's working on this. What do you think? You got a lot of work to do, Dad. You're still a little ways off on that. I mean, and sometimes that comes out, but the big idea here is that it's important to take stock of where we are on these things and think about, okay, what do I need to do to grow? And remember, there's grace, and we can all grow, and the Spirit helps us to grow. So I want to now transition to talking about what science says about parenting styles. And what I would encourage you to do, and I'll remind you and prompt you to think about these things, is how is what science is saying about parenting styles connected to what the Bible says and what we just talked about in terms of parenting styles. So Diana Baumrin, a pretty well-known parenting researcher, decades ago, started research on a style of parenting, or I should just say parenting styles in general, and came up with this idea of what's now known as authoritative parenting. But she thought of parenting styles as really having two dimensions. The first dimension, parental responsiveness or warmth, so the degree to which the parent responds to the child's needs in an accepting, supportive manner. So that's dimension 1. Dimension 2, parental Demandingness, so this idea of firmness, the degree to which the parent expects and insists on mature, responsible behavior from the child. So firmness. Now, it can be easy to think of these as along a spectrum. Over on one side is warmth, on the other side is firmness. That's not what Baumrind and other psychologists are suggesting. It's that these are on their own spectrums, and you need both of those for effective parenting. So with these in mind, she came up with 4 different styles, and other researchers have talked about this, 4 different styles of parenting. So there's the authoritative parent. High firmness, high warmth. They use warmth, firm control, rational, issue-oriented discipline in which emphasis is placed on the development of self-direction or, in my mind, reliance on God. The authoritarian parent. Use punitive, absolute, and forceful discipline and place a premium on obedience and conformity. So low warmth, high firmness. This idea of permissive parents or indulgent parents is another way to think about that. Characterized by responsiveness but low demandingness, and who are mainly concerned with the child's happiness. So thought of as encouraging parent. You might be familiar with this. I think a more recent term for this style of parenting is gentle parenting. So high warmth, low discipline, low firmness. Uninvolved parent. Another way to think about this is indifferent parent, so characterized by low levels of both responsiveness and demandingness. So here's some more information about that. And again, the slides will be sent out, so don't worry if you don't catch all this. There's a lot of information up there in each box. And I'm not going to read through all these, but it just gives you an idea of how these different styles are characterized. So authoritative, authoritarian, indifferent, indulgent. Now, I don't know why, who named these. I don't know why they chose authoritative and authoritarian. I mean, those are too similar. They get very confusing. But authoritative is the preferred style, high warmth, high firmness. Authoritarian, as you can see on the image here, low responsiveness, but high demandingness. And then you can see indifferent and indulgent in some of the things that characterize that. But again, how does this connect with what we just talked about and what we see in the scriptures in terms of how God is with us? Jesus is as a father, as a leader, but what we are called to in the scriptures, Ephesians 6:4 in particular. So what I see is on the high demandingness side, training and instruction of the Lord, involving that discipline piece as well. And then responsiveness, do not exasperate them. Warmth, love, responsiveness, support, humility, gentleness. I'm not down on gentle parenting in and of itself. I mean, high warmth, yes, but you need the other dimension in there as well. And it's so interesting to me that God lays this out. We see this in his nature. We see this in his scriptures. We see this in how he works with us and what he calls us to. And what science is saying in a lot of ways is, yeah, that style and way of being and parenting is effective and leads to these positive outcomes. So here are a few. Children raised in authoritative houses are more psychologically mature, responsible, self-assured, creative, curious, socially skilled, and academically successful than their peers with other parenting styles. Children raised in authoritarian homes are more dependent, more passive, less socially adept, less self-assured, and less curious. Think about Colossians 3, verse 21. Do not exasperate your children, lest they become discouraged. That's high demandingness, high firmness, but low warmth. That's what the research is suggesting. That style of parenting leads to these negative outcomes that, again, were identified or have been identified in Scripture. Children raised in indulgent households are less mature, less responsible, and more conforming to their peers. Children raised in different homes are often impulsive and more likely to be involved in delinquent behavior and in precocious experimentation with sex, drugs, and alcohol. But again, going back to the indulgent household, less responsible, more conforming to their peers, those are the kids that are coming up in households without rules and guidance and high expectations and demanding this from their parents. So, yeah, gentleness is great. Gentle parenting is okay to an extent, but it misses this other dimension, and there's not great outcomes associated with that style of parenting. You need both of those things. And so, the question that hopefully has come up, or I'll prompt you to think about it now, how do I become that type of parent? How do I get there? How do I get the warmth, the responsiveness, but the demandingness with instruction, training, and firm discipline? How do I get there? Well, as we think about that type of parenting, the reality is that we can pray for our kids, which we should, but when we're thinking about our parenting styles, that's really about us and who I am and how I can change and how I can be what God or who God calls me to be. So here's a model that hopefully is helpful, just some ideas, practical ideas about becoming this type of parent. I call it the peace model, just hopefully helpful to remember that way. So pray, yeah, I mean, look, pray for your kids, that's important, but pray, God, change me so I can be the parent like you and who you have called me to be. It's got to start with us, not with, God, change my child. And I'm not saying that that's not part of the deal, and those prayers can be important, but again, we've got to start with us. God, change me. Pray and use other spiritual discipline to change our character and our nature. Engage your community of parents, accountability and community. So this picture here is with very close family friends. So the Carrie, so that's Roland Carey, the father, over on the left, and then me doing that really cool, awesome thing with my fingers there, and then all of our kids there in the middle. We had taken a trip out to Harper's Ferry in West Virginia, so we started doing a camping trip out there with them. They live right across the street from us, so I was really surprised that they wanted to spend more time at a campground with us. But we decided to, and it just worked out this way, so not necessarily suggesting that everybody should do this, but to the extent that you can, it worked out that we could move up and live right across the street from very close friends. We're all in the same stage of life. So their kids are around our kids' age. They're Christians. We're Christians. We're trying to do this Christian thing together because the reality is that we do need each other to make this happen. That's why God has given us the body. Different skills, different perspective, trying to help each other. Accountability and community. Accountability can be thought of at times as, or have this negative connotation, but accountability is just about help. I need help. That day that I was talking about the other day, I needed help. And so community is about helping each other to grow, helping parent each other's kids, and doing this thing together. You have to engage your community of parents. Awareness of self. That was part of that exercise before. What are your weaknesses? What are your tendencies? What are the situations that you can get in where you're not an Ephesians 6:4 parent? That takes a bit of reflection. Center on Christ. I have meditation up there as a spiritual discipline. Again, the reality is that you see in Jesus both dimensions of Ephesians 6:4. You see the warmth, the love. You think about the woman at the well. I mean, he knew that she was in some serious sin and alerted her to the fact that he knew that and understood that, but he doesn't chastise her. He doesn't, discipline her. He doesn't call down, fire from heaven, but he loves her. He comes down to her level to be with her, is compassionate, responsive. And what does she do? She goes back to the town and becomes an evangelist for Jesus. That's warmth and love and responsiveness and being supportive. But you also see the firm Jesus, the corrective Jesus as well. I mean, he straight up called out Peter in one particular instance, right? Get behind me, Satan. Whew, that sounds like some corrective action there. So it's not just all love, lovey-dovey Jesus. That's part of his nature, the warmth. But there's this other side of Jesus as well. So center on Christ so you can become like Christ in that way. And then educate yourself, Bible, lessons, books, podcasts, so that what's in you is what comes out of you in that education and training for your children. So that's the peace model. And the takeaway, the thought is, well, what does all this mean for you as a parent? So I presented a lot, and you could try to do it all, but I wouldn't recommend that. You'll get into guilt and fail probably and get discouraged, and then you'll put it to the side. But what are one or two things that you can take away from that and work on and help you to grow to be an Ephesians 6:4 parent? Okay, so I'm not going to take questions at this point, and I'm cool to not take a break either. You want to just keep plugging away? Okay, everybody's good? Let's stand up just for a second. Just stand where you are. Okay. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. As we come back in, if you could take your seats, that'd be great. I should have mentioned this up front, but I always forget this. So, being from New York, I'm a big Yankees fan. So, I guess there's no Yankees fans out there, maybe a couple. But as I was getting ready to come up to Boston and thinking about things, I thought, I cannot go up there if the Red Sox are ahead of the Yankees in the standings. And so that worked out. So Yankees are ahead of the – I tried that joke last night too, and it just tanked. So anyway. Yeah. And honestly, I mean, who has time to watch the Yankees these days, especially with poor kids running around? But anyway, well, one thing that I did want to mention related to the prior class was something that Phil and Mike and I were talking about. So as was mentioned in my bio, so I teach and do research at West Point. And one of the things that I'm most interested in is this idea of healthy emotional well-being, emotional regulation, and more specifically what's called emotional integration. So the extent to which we take an interest in our emotional stance and we learn from it what our emotional responses communicate about who we are, our values, our goals, the self. And so we did some research to look at what predicts that, so what's correlated with good emotional well-being, emotion regulation, emotional integration. And then we looked at, well, what does that predict? So what outcomes is that way of being associated with? And as far as predictors go, we asked questions about father warmth, mother involvement, father involvement, father autonomy support, and mother autonomy support. All good things. And then once we did the analysis, we looked at what correlated most strongly with emotional integration. And so I'd ask you to think about what we found. So it's a healthy way of being emotionally. And the strongest correlation, again, above all those things, was father warmth. So related to some of the things we were just talking about. Emotional integration, and actually father warmth, but maybe via emotional integration or healthy emotion regulation, correlated with empathy. And those things all predicted each other. So father warmth predicted healthy emotion regulation, and then healthy emotion regulation predicted empathy. And so our takeaway, and prior research supports this and has suggested this, is that father warmth or parental warmth broadly is a way of socializing a healthy experience with our emotions. And that becomes internalized through that socialization, and then that comes out of us in the form of empathy. Yeah, so I can sit with and understand and be comfortable and okay with my emotional experience, both positive and negative emotions. And I can be that way with other people. I can empathize with their emotional experience as well. Again, prior research confirmed that. We thought it was interesting that above and beyond those other ways of being in terms of parenting styles, father warmth seemed to have a pretty profound effect. So I think an important takeaway for us as we think about parenting styles and how we can be with our kids. So what I'd like to get into in this class is a focus on adolescent brain development. Now, some of your kids are within that adolescent time period, age 10 to 25. But I think it's also good, even if your kids aren't in that range, to have some knowledge and know what to expect and prepare for. So, and this is just kind of generally, how does the brain work? So I think this can be helpful. So we'll describe some of those changes. There are unique changes happening in the brain for children, but different types of changes happening for adolescents that I think are important to highlight. And then I'll give you some ideas and strategies, and then we'll have time for questions to ask a little bit about some of the tools that I'll talk about and present that are appropriate for adolescents, really appropriate for all of us, but appropriate for children as well at any stage of the game. And you can ask questions about that at the end. So one thing as we're thinking about our kids as adolescents, we're preparing for that stage of their life and our stage of parenting, there can be this negative connotation with that. And so the story I like to tell is anytime that my wife and I, or just me, we're out with the kids, and we come across another parent who has either had teens or they have teens now, their first response, and I mean, no joke, this is how it goes. Oh, your kids are so beautiful and lovely. And then immediately the next response is, just wait till they become teenagers. And it's like, really? Like that's the idea of adolescence and the expectation? Now, look, I get that there are unique challenges in that time period. I mean, Mike has adolescents, but worked with the teen ministry, was a teacher, middle school teacher, high school teacher, coach. Again, teen ministry. So I've worked with teens and their parents for a long time, and I get that there are unique challenges there. But if that's what we're starting with, that's problematic, and I don't think is a godly perspective. Do you think God sees your kids that way? His creation that way? I don't think so. And so that can be the perspective, not just from other parents, but from books as well. Look at these titles. Get out of my life. Yes, your teen is crazy, which happens to be a great book, actually. So you got to get past the cover. And sometimes, hey, we're all crazy, but sometimes that comes up. But ending the parent-teen control battle, this is so awkward, which it can be. He's not lazy. Idea here is just that, that can be the perspective. Even when you look at memes, based on my lack of experience, I will always follow your advice that no teenager to their parent ever. And I think it's appropriate to laugh at these things and to maybe shape our perspective to a little, or maybe validate our experience. But I don't think it's the way God thinks about adolescence and his creation. And I think it's important for us to not slip into that, quite frankly, worldly mentality. And if you have, I get that. There were times as a teacher and as a teen minister where I'm like, yes, this teen is crazy. They are crazy. But we have to reshift our focus and rethink about how we think about that time period. So I think one helpful exercise is to reflect on our own adolescent experience. And so I shared this with the parents last night, and when I put that up there, they're like, oh, you could hear some shudders from the crowd, which can be potentially an uncomfortable experience, thinking about some of those experiences from our adolescence. And even going back to our childhood, to kind of put ourselves in that position so that we can relate to our children and our adolescents better. And the model for that example is Jesus Christ himself, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but lowered himself, became flesh. Why? So that he could better relate to our experience as his creation, as embodied fleshly beings. So that's the model or our example for us in an exercise like this. Why would we do that? Why would we put ourselves in that position? So we can better relate to our kids. And so something important to think about and go back to. So really briefly, adolescence, the word comes from the Latin adolescere, which means to grow into adulthood. So it's a stage in childhood that is a developmental, transitional time that is bringing us or helping people to get to adulthood. God designed it, but we've termed it, it's not a term that shows up in the Bible, but we've termed it to just help us to think about some of those unique changes that happen that, again, prepare us for adulthood. And so our demarcation here is generally around 10, so it begins in puberty, and then 25, which is roughly the time that a lot of these big brain development changes happen. So it comes to a close at that point, but also young people start to take on adult responsibility. So perhaps they're graduating from college, taking on a first job, getting married around that time, that kind of thing. So 10 to 25 is that demarcation. So I want to talk about some of the changes that happen in the brain during adolescence. So it's not a super deep dive into this, but I want to give you enough to help you to think about these things and then think about how that can inform what you do with your children and with your adolescents. And then it's important to think about, so what does this mean for me as a parent? So a little bit about how your brain works. So your brain is made up of a lot of stuff, but billions of neurons. So these neurons have different components. So the body, or the soma here, is the central part of the neuron or the brain cell. The axon are these arm-like structures that carry messages or neurotransmitters away from the soma out to other neurons. It's how neurons communicate with each other. So those chemical messengers or messages are sent out, away through the axon, out the axon terminal to another cell, and they come in through these dendrites or these finger-like structures. And so that's how brain cells communicate with each other. Now, brain cells generally are organized into different regions of the brain, so they function in a very similar way, but they're all connected to each other in different ways, and that's a sign of healthy brain development, is when the brain can become fully integrated. So it's all working together, kind of like the body of Christ. Different parts working together for healthy growth and development. So these neurons collectively appear as a grayish color. And so they're talked about as gray matter. It's talked about as gray matter, referred to as gray matter, the collection of neurons. So that's one type of matter in the brain. And kids have a lot of gray matter. And as they enter into adolescence, that gray matter is reduced in size. And I'll talk about why in just a moment and how that works. Another type of matter in the brain is called white matter. And so remember, I highlighted this as the axon carries messages away from the cell. So during different points in life, but during adolescence, that axon structure is overlaid with what's called myelin. And so it's this fatty sheath. It looks like a whitish color. And that is done to speed up the speed at which messages are sent between the neurons. Actually, when myelin is laid down on that axon, it sends those neurotransmitters or those messages between neurons 100 times faster. So what we see during adolescence is that white matter increases rapidly, especially in certain regions of the brain. So that's interesting. Gray matter goes down, neurons are being eliminated, but white matter goes up. Why is that? What is happening there? Well, generally speaking, the brain is becoming more efficient. So it's tagging neurons and these connections between neurons, known as the synapses, as either being important and useful and used or not. So the ones that aren't being used are eliminated. The ones that are being used are retained. And then, again, so it's tagging it as that's important, that's a useful connection. And now it's going to overlay that with that white matter or that myelin sheath. So again, gray matter goes down, white matter goes up. But, again, it happens in certain regions, but according to something. And this is where training becomes really important. That developmental process happens in response to a child's environment, in response to experience. And so we can think about the brain, especially during adolescence, as being very malleable, moldable, or changeable. So when you think about the scriptures talking about training during childhood and adolescence, it really speaks to the importance of that during that time period and what's going on in the brain. So the things that adolescents and young people are thinking about, the things that they're doing, the skills that they're adopting, what they're learning, the training and discipline that they're experiencing during that time will only be solidified during their adolescent time period in childhood, but adolescent time period in particular, because it's signaling to the brain that these are important connections to sustain, maintain, and enhance and improve, which is a beautiful design. We are wonderfully and remarkably made. And so, as I mentioned, the brain is incredibly plastic during adolescence. It remains plastic throughout life, so that's, hey, good news. We can always change. But it's incredibly plastic during the adolescent time period. So when we think about training, those things are more easily and reliably accomplished before adulthood. So the training and the things that our young people are exposed to really matter, especially during adolescence. So where do those things change? How does it change? Well, let's get into that, and we'll talk a little bit about neurotransmitters. So we'll talk about different regions of the brain. I like this quote, and the laughs are probably from experience. I think we've all probably experienced this. Someday when our prefrontal cortexes are fully developed, we'll look back on this and shake our heads. And we've probably had some experiences ourselves, but also can think back to experiences with our kids like, what were you thinking when you were doing that? What were you thinking when you posted that picture on Instagram or Twitter? What were you thinking when you were playing with those matches outside in the woods when the leaves were really dry and all the dry debris was around? What were you thinking? But that's the wrong question. And by the way, that was an experience that I had when I was growing up that resulted in the neighbors calling the fire department and the fire department showing up and me getting in the ambulance. I was okay. But me getting in the ambulance and having to go to the hospital and me pleading with the ambulance driver, please do not tell my dad, who was sleeping because he was working third shift. So we do things and we ask, what were you thinking? But that's the wrong question. They weren't thinking. And part of that is because the brain, regions of the brain that are responsible for those kinds of thinking, forethought, executive attention, and so forth, planning, anticipating consequences, it's just not fully developed and it's not fully integrated with the rest of the brain. So when we talk about brain structures and brain development, especially during adolescence, we'll talk about two. There's more going on there, but two that are really important. So prefrontal cortex, front of the brain, not fully developed and fully integrated to the rest of the brain until around age 25, but responsible for higher order thinking, planning, judgment, response, inhibition, anticipating consequences. Now, that doesn't mean that young people can't make good decisions or do the right thing. So it's not an out, it's not an excuse, but that develops last. Actually, the brain develops from back to front. So you can see the limbic system up there. The limbic system involves the amygdala, other brain regions in that particular region. That region involves our emotional responses, our motivations, our drives, desires. That develops before the prefrontal cortex. And so that's fully online for young people. And the regulator of that system doesn't develop until later. Now, you might be questioning God and his thought process and design around that. Why would you go in that order? And I don't know, something we can ask God when we get to heaven. But think about how important our motivation, our drive, our emotions are in our lives. They move us in directions. They push us out to try and experiment and learn, which is in many ways really good. It can get us into trouble, but we need that part of our lives, in particular, our emotional experiences. And I think sometimes we can get into this perspective of emotions are bad, especially as a Christian, get me into trouble, don't need those, I need some more reflective thought. And the reality is, you need both of those things working together. We serve an emotional God, a God who experiences anger, frustration, hatred, disappointment. But he experiences joy and love and all these other positive emotions. He experiences both of those, and he's designed us to experience both of those as well. We need both of those. But the challenge can be, how do we navigate that in spiritually healthy ways? And how do we navigate that, or how do we help our young people navigate those things as well? It's really important that we don't try to diminish or suppress or get rid of our negative emotions and our children's negative emotions. They need all kinds of different emotions. They're all useful in some way, shape, or form. They just need help navigating those things. And it starts when they're really young. So those are some of the changes that are happening in the brain. I'll say just a bit more about that. So first, patterns of activation within the PFC, prefrontal cortex, generally become more focused. Adolescents improve in two areas: response inhibition. Oh, yeah, that lighting the match in that particular moment, I'm not going to do that. Inhibit that response. Or this person, really made me mad, and so I'm not going to lash out and punch them or say something inappropriate. And executive function, which are some of those things that I mentioned before: forethought, planning, decision-making in general. So those things change in the adolescent brain pretty substantially. Second, activity in the PFC, so prefrontal cortex, becomes increasingly coordinated with activity in other parts of the brain, including the limbic region. Again, it's not just that we need the prefrontal cortex, we need the limbic region as well, but we need these things to be working together. And throughout adolescence and into our adult lives, those things become increasingly coordinated and integrated, and that leads to healthy development. So another big change that happens during adolescence is with neurotransmitters. These are chemical messengers in the brain that get passed back and forth between neurons. And so here you have a neuron here. You can see that myelin sheath there. sending a message out. This is what it looks like within the synapse or synaptic cleft. So these dots represent a neurotransmitter being released from that axon terminal and then out into the synapse or synaptic cleft and then received by the receptor or dendrite of this other neuron. And so those chemical messengers are known as neurotransmitters. And so two big changes with neurotransmitters during adolescence. The first is dopamine, a very familiar neurotransmitter, I would imagine, involved with the response of pleasure. So things that excite us, that are pleasurable, that feel good, the things that are pleasurable and exciting for our kids, when they experience those things, dopamine is released. And so it feels good, and so it conveys this idea of, well, I should repeat that behavior. For my son William, it's playing with the characters from the movie Cars, 1, 2, and 3. He's obsessed with those. And so a lot of dopamine going on in his brain when he experiences that. But the change that happens during adolescence and how those brains are different from adult brains is that adolescents have more dopamine, so high levels of dopamine. So when they post something and they get a like, so this idea of social reward, that's a big dopamine spike for adolescents. It's also why young people are very responsive to the effects of drugs. So taking a drug by an adult would generally elicit a certain pleasurable response, but for adolescents it's even greater. So when young people are exposed to drugs, it's why that during that time period, that's typically where addiction starts. It typically doesn't, like if we can prevent young people from experimenting with drugs until later, there's a good chance they'll never become addicted to drugs. So higher levels of dopamine, there's also more dopamine receptors in the brain. So again, more higher levels, more receptors. When they're feeling good, man, they are feeling good. But they also have a lower baseline level of dopamine. So if they aren't feeling good, if they aren't doing something exciting, they are bored. And when they're bored, they are really bored. So think about your level of boredom and then take it down, 20 decibels or 20 notches or whatever the case may be. And so it's not the case that we always need to be engaging them in these exciting activities and that kind of thing, but it can help us to understand their experience a bit better. Again, when they're bored, they're bored. Another change that happens, this idea of, or another neurotransmitter, serotonin. Those levels of serotonin fluctuate during adolescence. And serotonin has different functions, but it's a mood regulator. And so because of that up and down levels, that's what contributes to this idea of mood fluctuation or teens and adolescents being moody. So those hopefully describe some of those changes. These changes make adolescents more emotional, more sensitive to stress, and more motivated by rewards because that feeling of boredom is very uncomfortable and more likely to engage in sensation seeking than other groups. One other thing I'll mention really quickly, and then we'll get into some of these tools, is that there's this idea during adolescence of the reminiscence bump. And when you think about your adolescent time period, you can probably remember things very vividly, more vividly than potentially what you did yesterday, or maybe what you did this morning. And part of that is because of these levels of dopamine. When we experience things that elicit this emotional response, these high levels of dopamine, it gets encoded into our memory, into our hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that's responsible for memory and learning, a lot more deeply. And so one takeaway is, how can we help our kids, our adolescents, experience these exciting and memorable things that are associated with God, that are associated with our family, that are associated with the church, so that it gets so, deeply encoded into their lives. I was commenting to Mike as we started, the beautiful stained glass windows back there. So I grew up going to a Presbyterian church, and in the back of our church, so a similar location, there's this beautiful stained glass image of Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. And for whatever reason, that was just a positive experience for me. Dopamine receptors going off. I mean, if I just sit back and close my eyes for a minute, I can put myself in that position very easily. And that's a little bit about how dopamine works. So, okay, those are the brain changes. So what? What do we do with that? Well, because of the emotional changes that are happening during adolescence, it's an opportune time for warmth that promotes emotional connection. And that starts now with our kids, our young kids. My daughter, right before bed, one of my daughters, right before bed, she just all of a sudden gets really scared and sometimes starts crying. And if I have something to do or I want to go hang out with my wife, I can get really frustrated with that. Like, just get it together. We're here. Everybody's fine. Did anything happen last night? No, so it's going to be the same thing tonight. I mean, I can respond that way sometimes. But I have to come down to her level. That just exasperates her. That just gets her more emotional. But I have to come down to her level and connect and help her understand that emotional experience and soothe that and help her with that situation. And again, that starts now in our parenting journey. The second thing is, because of neuroplasticity, it's an opportune time for training, which involves firm discipline and instruction. What they experience, that training, that discipline, that instruction, that will get encoded in their brains much more deeply during adolescence than it will other times in their lives. So, what do? Here are a few specific thoughts. It's not an exhaustive list, and again, just take one or two that could be helpful, and don't feel guilty if you aren't doing all these things. All right, so what do? Connect them with community. So we exist in a time where community around the world, in the United States in particular, is diminishing. It is fading so fast, and it can happen in churches as well. And our kids need multiple connections with other kids, with other adults, with mentors. A web of connections helps them to grow spiritually and emotionally and socially and all these other things. And I shared my example earlier. Help them reflect. So within that community, connecting them with different mentors. I mean, my girls and my son, they have natural mentors right across the street. Roland and Terry, his wife. And they already feel like they can have conversations with them, but as they get into adolescence and grow, they're going to need those connections, so maybe they don't feel comfortable going to you as a parent, but they can go to a mentor and get that connection and get that love and support that they need. Relatedly, and I'll just say a little bit about this. I'll be brief with it, but I think very important as we think about healthy emotional development. I alluded to this earlier. I think sometimes we can just try to diminish what we call negative emotions. But a healthy way of being with our emotions is this idea of emotional integration. And here are 4 A's that are part of healthy emotional integration. Number 1, be aware of our emotion. And so in the instance that I shared with my daughter, I asked her, okay, what emotion are you feeling? And I might list off or explain a few, but that helps her identify the experience so that she can then accept the emotion. Sometimes we're so quick to, I got to change my emotional experience. This is uncomfortable. But one of the healthiest ways to experience our emotions is accept that this is my emotional experience right now. God has designed us with different emotions, so let me accept that emotion. Actively explore the emotion. So where did this emotion come from, and what is it conveying about my values, my goals, my sense of self? And then how can I assimilate that into my experience? So now that I understand these things, what should I do with that? So relatedly, we should help them reflect and meditate and 2-year-old Lily takes away everybody's excuses and says that I can't meditate. Just kidding. I caught her at a moment when she was 2 that looked like she was meditating. I mean, she even has her hands together. It's amazing. But she was just sitting there. But big idea with meditation is it's an opportunity for us to disconnect and sit and breathe and connect with ourselves and with God. And so one way that we practice this with our kids, they're younger, and I took this from a family in India, actually. We call it candle time. So we'll light a candle, we'll pray together, we'll talk about a scripture maybe that we had talked about earlier that week, and then we set a timer for, we last about a minute, honestly, so hey, a minute counts. And we'll just focus on our breath and the candle, and we'll try to think about that scripture or just our breath, and we just do that for a minute together, maybe at the end of the day, but can be helpful to meditate. Teach them spiritual principles, lots of different ways to do that from the Bible as we walk along the road, as they're lying down and so forth, but a lot of different ways to do that. All right. A lot to say about this one, and maybe some questions will come up, but we need to now, yes, now, help them develop a healthy, spiritually healthy relationship with technology. And that starts with our example as parents, right? What is our relationship with screens and with technology? And are we prioritizing connection with our phones and screens or with our kids when they're there, when they're in the room? And one thing that my wife and I have tried to do already is model, model boundaries, but then model in particular a boundary of we leave our phones out in our kitchen at night when we're sleeping. And that's really important for kids, especially as they get into adolescence, because two things, and prior to adolescence, but two things. One is usually at night, if they're on it, it's going to disrupt their sleep, and kids need a lot of sleep. But two, usually what they're getting into at those times is not great, not a healthy thing. And so that's a firm boundary that we have in our house. I'm not saying that needs to be your boundary, but we do need to think about these things, think about how we're modeling those, and what kind of expectations we're placing on our kids around that and being firm with it. And I'm not going to say, well, it's got to be 2 hours a day or whatever the case may be. It's got to be why are these our boundaries? Why are we engaging with technology, and how can we stick with that? Okay, last one, sleep and exercise. And that's one of the things that technology can really take away from, both of those. And sleep and exercise are so important for the development of the temple, right, of the Holy Spirit. Kids need a lot of sleep at night, so important to set those habits up. And then they need exercise to be outside, engaged, using those bodies, using those things that God has given us. So, takeaway, what do all these things mean for you as a parent? Again, don't get overwhelmed with all those ideas and tips and tools. Just think about a few that you could utilize. Okay, I think we have